we get to the questions, we had someone else come in I wanted to recognize. Is this Steve Hank from Dublin Unified School District Superintendent? There he is, right there. So thank you very much for being here. So I'm just going to read, and I think, you know, we might
lock the door now that we have so many superintendents in the process of beginning a search. So.
Yeah. So let me just put the first question out, and then we can decide who's most appropriate or who would like to start. So why are the state revenues projected by the LAO significantly higher than those being used by the governor? So Carolyn mentioned that.
Carolyn addressed that because she is from the LAO's office. But you know what I've heard from a number of other sources as well is that the governor's projections, it's not so much that theirs are exceptionally high, it's that the governor's were deliberately low. And that economists that have looked at it have said that it was not, that it's not that they're erring on the side of rosy optimism. And if you know the LAO's track record, you know they're not all of a sudden like just like, hey, let's, you know, count all this money and spend it. It's kind of the reverse. It's that the governor very deliberately decreased it. But I'll let you give the details.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Minia. In response to the governor's revenue projections, we felt that there was some inconsistency in that the governor was projecting that there would be an economic recovery and that things were sort of on the up and up for the state, but then you sort of read that narrative and then you look at the numbers and it's not, something is not adding up. So when we looked at the governor's revenues more closely, we felt that they had essentially lowballed some projections, particularly around property tax revenues and that sort of thing, particularly given the more recent trends in terms of property values as well as the more recent trends regarding the stock market. And given the recent trends and the sustained growth in both of those sectors, that's sort of how we arrived at where we did and why we had some differences with the governor's office.
Okay, thank you. The next one is the LAO recommends including both, I think I made TIG and HTS, which is homeschool, right? The Assembly proposal recommends maintaining it as a separate add-on. Can you please explain why?
Yes, I can, and I think it's one of those tough issues when you're trying to forge a compromise. And I think we all are in agreement about home-to-school transportation, that that needs to stay out because it needs to be fixed. So that's a separate issue, and I believe we have some pretty broad agreement that we need to open that back up, make it more equitable to a number of districts that are just not receiving any money or just small fractions. On TIG, which was originally desegregation money that certain districts were able to apply for in a given period of time, some of them are under court orders, some may not be anymore, but this money has become kind of a staple of their budgeting. It's about $1 billion, and what it's come down to as we've crafted this compromise is that the negative impact on the districts to take it away is far outweighs the benefit of spreading the $1 billion through everyone else, if that makes sense. In other words, it's not in the scale of the budget, while for the sense of having a better formula, it would be good to do it, but to have a workable formula given all of the pressures and interests and realities, it's hard to do it. And so that's kind of the explanation. I think personally, I would like to have fixed that at this time. About all we can say on that is that gradually over time it will decrease, as it will not, I think this is correct, not be receiving a COLA in the future. So hopefully it will begin to level out. But you have San Diego Unified, Los Angeles Unified, I believe San Jose, San Francisco as recipients. So while this is a budget process, it's also a political process. Does that answer the question?
going to take those into consideration. If not, why not? And what can we do to ensure that those dollars also follow transfer students to the receiving school, follow the students?
Well, it's interesting because you're getting into the difference between federal money and state money. So Title I schools are designated as school sites that are Title I, and that's a federal designation for federal funding. But this is a question we hear frequently when we look at the numbers. And you still say, well, some schools are getting more. Sometimes that's federal money that is then added on to what you're seeing. So we're never going to be in a place where all children are getting the same amount. And I'll ask Carolyn perhaps to elaborate a little bit about how the federal funds interact with what we're doing here at the state. But they're under federal allocations and federal rules and guidelines, and we can't really supersede that here in our process. And in terms of the Title I question, that is a school site designation. It isn't a student-specific designation. So that's why that money doesn't follow a student. It stays at the school site.
Yes, and you have it exactly right, Assemblywoman. So Title I monies are allocated to districts. How much a district receives is calculated by the feds. It comes into California and it's dispersed through the Department of Education, but the Department of Education in California really has no say over how much of that money is going to go to a particular district. It's all based on federal formulas. And as a result, we at the LAO we urge the legislature to exercise great caution in aligning your budget with a particular federal calculation, since that federal calculation may change and we may or may not have an ability to exercise any control over that change. And so you don't want to necessarily count on something from the feds that might not be there in the future or might not be there in the same way in the future. Moreover, on Title I, while it does go to districts and while there are, it is spread out among districts, typically in a district that receives a significant amount of money in Title I, they're only able to allocate money down to school sites that have upwards of 60% low-income students, because the feds promulgate a very specific allocation methodology that means that you can't actually have split your dollars equally among all your students and just send it out that way. You have a